Hey there and welcome back. This is Felix from Gold Vintage Watches. Watch designer legend Gerald Genta wasn't just the Royal Oak, the Omega Constellation C-shape, or his own brand. As the LVMH company has just announced the relaunch of Genta's own brand with the help of his widow and a large stack of unpublished designs, we wondered what he actually stood for, what his design philosophy was, so to speak. Here you can see an Omega Constellation C-shape with line dial created by Gerald Genta. There's a certain feeling that immediately makes a Genta design stand out. But what exactly is it? Of course, there are already many videos, articles, opinions about Genta. However, with the help of our article writer Marcos, this will be a slightly more analytical video about the world's first holistic watch designer. It will be less about the watches and more about the design elements that make up a Genta design across brands, eras and styles. By connecting all the dots, we will try to establish some basic principles of Genta's design line from the early years in the 1950s to the 1990s. To summarize, we would say that there are at least 4 core principles around which his designs circle. Number 1, increments of time. Number 2, encapsulating time. Number 3, the time's embrace. And finally, number 4, redefining time. Sounds strange and confusing at first, we know that. But when we go into more detail, we will explain exactly what we mean by these rather unusual descriptions. But before we start comparing his work, let's begin with an overview. In total, Genta is said to have sold hundreds, if not thousands, of designs to various manufacturers. What we have found special about him is that he was not always directly employed by a company, but rather a self-made designer who started his own business at a young age. Without the protection of a fixed employment contract, I think that speaks for great self-confidence in his own work and a trust that his designs will be successful. And as already mentioned, at a very young age. Here you can see at a glance several Gerald Genta wristwatch designs from various watch manufacturers from the last century. The Universal Genève Pole Router from 1954, the Audemars Piguet Disco Volante also from 1945, Rolex King Midas from 1962, the Constellation C-shape from 1964 from Omega, IWC's Shadow from 1966, IWC's Da Vinci from 1969, Audemars Piguet's Royal Oak from 1972, IWC's Golf Club from 1975, Bulgari's Roma also from 1975, IWC's Engineer from 1976, Patek's Nautilus also from 76, and Cartier's Pasha from 1985. On the surface, all these pieces are quite different. Very diverse, different shapes and materials, but we still claim that many of them have common basic principles. So let's start with the first basic principle, increments of time. In other words, apart from the hands, what else can indicate the lapsed time on a dial of a watch? In many of the watches presented before, but also in some others, we find, yes, you could say, hidden ways of dividing time into smaller increments. Increments of time, so to speak. Let's take a closer look at the pole router to move from the abstract to the concrete level of description. On the outer edge of the dial, we see a rather unusual arrangement of hour markers for the time. These are not only classic markings, but also a complete scale embedded in the dial, indicating even the tenth of a second. In this close-up of an old Universal Genève pole router, a closer look at the dial reveals the turned edge. It's not technically part of the bezel, as it sits in the glass, but we will come to that in a moment. In the pole router, this additional design indication of time sits within the bezel, but in subsequent designs, the bezel often became the cornerstone of this very subconscious subdivision of time. The Disco Volante is the most obvious of the examples shown, as there are so many different and prominent options. As seen here, a Universal Genève Disco Volante with an almost opulent bezel that takes motorized timekeeping to a whole new level. Genta originally developed this design for Audemars Piguet, and it was then adopted by other companies. Many models, especially in the early years, featured this design detail. The fluted bezel of the Constellation C-shape is another example. The screws on the Royal Oak and the cutouts on the Engineer SL from IWC can also be counted into this special category. So let's continue with the second basic principle, the encapsulation of time. All in all, this part is about case shapes. We've pointed out in other videos that every case shape has its own era. But the 1960s and 70s in particular were in time of liberation from the limitations of the round watch case. If you look at Gentas' large work, he was definitely no stranger to this trend. As early as 1962, he experimented with angular case designs and created one of the most archetypical Rolex watches ever, the pentagonal King Midas. Here you can see an extravagant white and yellow gold striped Rolex King Midas on its original orange box, as extravagant and limited as you can get with a Rolex design. The white and yellow gold stripe reference 4915 King Midas rests on its urn. If you are thinking of a particular watch design, Gerald Genta probably has a design for it. There's the square Nautilus and the Golf Club, the hexagonal Da Vinci, which is only attributed to him, the octagonal Royal Oak, and many more. And one of the most influential and holistically designed dress watches, the Golden Ellipse, is also repeatedly attributed to him, even though he was only an inspiration. And speaking of shapes, the Pasha by Cartier with its grid should not be overlooked. Let's follow up with point number 3, the embrace of time. As already mentioned when we talk about Genta classics today, the Royal Oak by Audemars Piguet and the Nautilus by Patek Philippe, the hype beasts of our generation, come to mind first. And because of the attention paid to these models, we talk a lot about integrated bracelets. A crucial factor for the sports watch genre and a detail that is usually also attributed to Mr. Genta. As seen here with this IWC. What can I say? It is a luxury sports watch with an integrated bracelet designed by Genta, even 2 years before the famous Royal Oak. And to give it its full name, an IWC reference 3501 with a beta 21 movement. And to credit Genta with the design of integrated bracelets is also correct. He was, if not the inventor, at least the most prominent figure who helped the integrated bracelets achieve their current status. Funnily enough, however, Genta's bracelet story did not begin in the headquarters of Audemars Piguet or Patek Philippe, but at Rolex. The aforementioned King Midas came onto the market 10 years before the Royal Oak was launched in 1972. And it was not the only iteration. Rolex alone adopted another sketch from Genta for its first quartz watch, the Beta 21 powered reference 5100 Texano in 1970. And the list goes on. After the Royal Oak and the Nautilus, there was also the Engineer SL from 1976, as well as other models from IWC's steel line. The Credos Locomotive from 1979, the Cartier Pasha from 1985, and several of his creations under his own brand, such as the Gold and Gold and the Success. Finally, we come to the first basic principle, redefining time. In a way, redefining time is a perfect link to the first point we mentioned. It is a principle that becomes particularly clear in Genta's later work. While in his earliest works, the perception of time was mainly altered by design, Genta later became known for his complications, like the Gerald Genta retrograde with Disney's Mickey design. It was a new way of telling the time, and I'm not talking about Mickey here. It was a retrograde minute complication with an additional jumping hour, a first for Genta's own brand of watches. Genta may have only been a designer on the paper, but he also understood the workings of his watches very well. From his beginnings at Universal Genève, he was intensively involved with the mechanics of his pieces. Under his brand, for example, he introduced the retrograde minute in combination with a jumping hour movement and later also a retrograde date. This can be seen in Gerald Genta's Be Retro watch with an early octo finissimo case. Retrograde date and minute combined in a jumping hour movement. A new interpretation of time. Incidentally, it is no coincidence that this watch looks like the inspiration for Bulgari's octo finissimo. This may sound just like a mechanical gimmick, but it completely redefines the way time is displayed on a watch. On a normal watch, seconds, minutes and hours move in a circle. Time is continuous, infinite and repetitive. In a watch with jumping hours and retrograde minutes, each hour forms its own unit. It's a perceptible digital unit that is, in a sense, detached from what happened before and what might come after. This means there is no happy hand position, but also that the design itself remains unchanged regardless of the moment. With all this accumulated knowledge about Gentas design, let's come to the last final point, the conclusion. If we put one and one together, we are dealing with the legacy of a designer who has tried to completely redesign and reinterpret the presence of a watch on the wrist. And the concept of time itself. How does a watch fit on your wrist? How are the different parts which used to be made in different places connected and form a unit? How do we perceive time? These are all questions that were not really asked before Jen's journey and are still often ignored today. Too many new designs are simply drawn from the books. It's like the Golden Ellipse, inspired by Genta and conceived by Rubli, also watch designer for Audemars Piguet and Patek Philippe, representing time differently through designs and functionality and playing with shapes by integrating the bracelet and unheard of case constructions is what makes Genta watches so unique. And these guidelines, whether consciously set or arising of their own accord, were certainly one of the reasons for its success. And the important thing is that they have evolved over time. With Genta, it is easy to see how earlier designs were based on different principles than later ones. The attempts to play with a time display are evident in his first creations, as both the Pro Router and the Disco Volante from the 1950s already play with the design of markers and bezels. The King Midas from 1962 is, I would argue, the first real glimpse of what Gen's design would later become. It is, in our opinion, one of the most important pillars of his design heritage. We argue that this King Midas design, for example, is central to Genta's legacy. It is the from Rome-inspired pentagonal watch with integrated bracelet. This incorporates for the first time key design features for which he is celebrated in our modern watch world. To describe what Gerald Genta really stood for and to sum it all up as best we can, we would point the Universal Genève Pro Router dial, the case and bracelet construction of the Rolex King Midas, and the way the time is displayed on the Gerald Genta jumping hour retrograde minutes. But we also have to say that when you are the first, just as Genta was the first holistic watch designer of his generation, everyone else has at least to follow in his footsteps. The crazy thing is that Gerald Genta was so good at reinventing himself and his designs while staying true to the meta principles we just outlined, that we still measure everything against his legacy.